Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Well, thank you, Caleb. Good evening. Welcome to the show. It's great to be back with you again at 6 o'clock as we kick off a new year of news, current affairs and politics. Thank you to all of you who saw me out and about over summer and said hello. It means a lot to me. It's great to hear from you directly about the issues concerning you and your community. I'm looking forward to a big 2024 and you're a key part of what makes this program such a success. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Despite what elite business leaders and left-leaning politicians might be saying, the reality is Australians do want to celebrate our country on the 26th of January, and a new poll out today makes that crystal clear. Australia is losing faith in the Albanese government's ability to help with cost of living, but at the same time, the Prime Minister remains evasive over those tax cuts due this year that were to put cash back into the pockets of middle-income Australians. Plus, it might be a new year, but we look set to face the same energy woes with state governments at odds with the federal government and key power stations failing as the weather starts to warm up. And 100 days after the Hamas atrocities in Israel, Penny Wong is finally set to visit the region. However, Wong won't be visiting the Hamas attack sites, unlike other world leaders. And Australia is still silent on the case against Israel in the International Criminal Court of Justice.
I think it's very unfortunate that the Foreign Minister appears to have needed to be dragged kicking and screaming to visit Israel. She or the Prime Minister should have been there within the first week of the 7 October attacks, as the British Prime Minister was, as the United States President was, as the German Chancellor was, as the EU Commission President was. Many other world leaders showed solidarity by doing so. It's disappointing it's taken Penny Wong this long to do so.
But first, well, I've had a good break with friends and families, and I hope you have had a good one too. It's good to be back on deck for what will be a challenging year. Now, I don't take for granted the privilege I have to be your voice each night to raise the issues I know you care about and say many of the things here that I know you're thinking of saying but are worried in these woke times that you can't say aloud. Well, I think I can predict this will be a year of pushing back. I think that's part of the mess the Albanese government has got itself into by misreading the public mood for being so out of touch. As always here on Credlin, we'll be pushing to make things better. A stronger economy, a safer world and a much more confident Australia. And we'll use my experience in Canberra, to borrow Don Chip's phrase, to keep the bastards honest. So what's happened over summer that I think you need to pick up on, and what's ahead of us for 2024? Well, January, as you know, is normally when we get all of our credit card bills from Christmas. And while there was a summer where I think a lot of us pulled our horns in spending-wise and cut back with our Christmases and perhaps, like many of you, holidayed at home, there's no doubt 2024 is when we will get more economic pain from Labor. Now, I'm not so much talking here about interest rates, although they will be higher for longer because of poor government policy. I'm talking about the things the government is doing that makes harder times worse, like its crazy energy obsession with renewables. Last week, federal Labor stopped the expansion of the Port of Hastings in Victoria to protect World Heritage wetlands, and in the process enraged state Labor, who want a massive expansion of offshore wind. Meanwhile, an outage at Victoria's coal-fired power plants in the Latrobe Valley is threatening blackouts. Last week, as the Australian newspaper reports this morning, Loy Yang A was offline 4 times in 4 days, following an 8-day outage over the New Year period. Energy experts are warning this makes Victoria's power grid inherently unstable in a state where brown coal still provides over 60% of electricity generation. A state, I might add, that hates coal, but is using taxpayer funds to keep open the coal power plants it wants to eventually close down. You figure that one out. So much for the PM's pre-election promise to cut your power bill by $275 per year. So far, they've gone up by well over 20% on his watch, making the cost of living crisis worse because high power prices hurt us at home, of course they do, but they also feed into the cost of almost everything else. Now, is it any wonder that the latest polls published in yesterday's News Corp papers have Labor bleeding on cost of living? More than half of all Australians believe the country's headed in the wrong direction, says the poll. 2/3 say they don't expect the government to do anything to fix the problems in the next 6 months. And a whopping 80% of us say the PM and his government has failed to address Australia's cost of living crisis. Right now, forget productivity, which the Reserve Bank says is key to building our prosperity. The government's only economic driver is immigration, and that's a problem. Because record levels of immigration are making cost of living crises worse by putting downward pressure on wages and upward pressure on our housing costs. With the Albanese government now more than halfway through its first term, it's clear that it's being driven by events rather than being on top of them. Indeed, so worried were Labor insiders about the government's massive dive in support, it's now polling 50-50 in two-party preferred terms with the coalition. The Prime Minister came back to work in early January. Now, I watched this and I thought it was very, very telling. Only this attempt by the PM at a reset, well, it fell flat because he had nothing to say when he returned. And straight after he left the microphone, he headed off to the cricket anyway. Tennis is coming up too. I suspect he'll be there in the next fortnight. Looking overseas, there's been no decisive response by the Albanese government to the wave of rioting and looting in PNG, even though a crisis there could produce a massive problem on our northern borders. Or it could lead to China sending tactical police to our very doorstep. There's also been no decisive response either by the government to the crisis in the Middle East. The Prime Minister dithered for a week about sending a frigate to the Red Sea and then let down our allies, the very same allies, of course, we're relying on for those nuclear submarines, which is madness given so much of our trade comes through the Red Sea trade route. Now, I think it was utterly gutless of the government and internationally embarrassing when we're supposed to be a fair income middle power, not to send a frigate. And yes, I know the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, she's left today to tour the region, but she won't be visiting the site of those Hamas atrocities as other world dignitaries have. And I expect she'll spend plenty of time lecturing Israel and trying to appease the pro-Palestinian lobby as much as she is about all the other issues facing Israel. And I don't expect, while she's there, that she's going to call out the disgusting anti-Semitism sweeping much of the world, including here.
The Coalition welcomes Foreign Minister Penny Wong finally taking the time to visit Israel, but we note that it is 3 months later than it should have been and 3 months later than our allied partners have around the world. But it is disappointing that on her trip to Israel, she hasn't found the time and won't find the time to get to southern Israel to visit those communities that were directly affected, to visit those kibbutzes that were the target of Hamas's attacks on the 7th of October, as many other world leaders have done. When asked about this on television today, the Prime Minister didn't seem to know anything about it. Well, it's time for Mr Albanese to take an interest in these matters and to direct his Foreign Minister to visit the affected sites so that they can develop an appreciation for just how significant these attacks have been on Israel and the Jewish community.
Look, part of the government's inertia is that many of its activists, its MPs, the union movement, the hardcore lefties in places like the Prime Minister's seat of Credlin, they don't really believe in Australia. Underlying the government's failed Indigenous voice referendum was deep embarrassment about a national story and a desire to retell it as a story of shame. Even now, the federal government is still promoting treaties and so-called treaty truth-telling and considering legislating local and regional Indigenous voices, despite the fact that over 60% of us voted against Indigenous separatism. Now, this is where the gulf between elites and mainstream Australians is just getting wider. While woke businesses virtue signal about destocking Australia Day merchandise and some 81 Green left local councils are refusing to have citizenship ceremonies on January 26, most of us, most Australians, still believe that our country is worth celebrating. Today, the Institute of Public Affairs published new polling showing that fewer than 1 in 5 Australians want to change the date of Australia Day, while nearly 9 out of 10 of us say they are proud to be Australian. And nearly 7 out of 10 of us say that Australian history was something to be proud of. The only age group that's less sure about our country are those aged under 25. Just 42% of them want to keep Australia Day on January 26, no doubt because of non-stop school and university propaganda about Invasion Day. Hardly surprising, given this is a generation that's been brainwashed since birth. They don't even know what a woman is anymore. So yes, it's great to be back on air tonight. It's good to be on your television, but by God, we've got a job ahead of us this year to take up the fight to all those who want to run our country down, and especially to the governments that are letting us down. Australia is still the best country in the world. I spent a lot of time in the bush and in the cities. I had a terrific break. I got around, and I tell you, I have not changed my view. But to stay that way, we need governments, state and federal, to lift their game. And if they won't or don't, then it's up to us to use our votes and show them the door. After last year's voice vote, ordinary Australians, well, we've found our voice, haven't we? And the silent majority is no longer staying silent. 2024, bring it on. Right, let's get the news out of Canberra now. Joining me, Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. Penny Wong has departed for the Middle East on a diplomatic mission to Jordan, Israel, the West Bank and the United Arab Emirates. The Foreign Minister will meet relatives of hostages taken on October 7, as well as Palestinian victims of Israeli settler violence in the West Bank.
The settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territories must be condemned.
A gesture that was dismissed by pro-Palestine protesters gathered outside the Israeli embassy in Canberra today.
My message to Penny Wong is too little, too late.
But her decision not to visit the southern Israeli towns at the centre of the October 7 massacre has sparked some backlash from Israeli government officials, as well as the opposition.
And it's important for social cohesion back in Australia, and I think she should take some extra time and make sure she visits those sites. Then she's had a comprehensive visit.
Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham says without visiting those sites, Senator Wong won't fully understand the atrocities. Senator Wong's visit to Israel and the Middle East is a serious case of better late than never, while the program being undertaken appears half-hearted. The Prime Minister has left the door open for offering more cost of living relief to the voting public before the May budget in a radio interview. Treasury is developing a list of potential cost of living relief measures, some of which could be fast-tracked to take some of the strain off families. Some relief will arrive on July 1, with most Australian workers to benefit from the Stage 3 income tax cuts. Resisting calls to scale them back, the PM says the changes will help make ends meet.
It does mean extra dollars in people's pockets.
They promised that they would deliver, and it's time to unambiguously commit to that.
The government is also moving to get more families into homes of their own. Applications for the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund have opened, giving builders access to funding for the construction of 40,000 affordable homes over 5 years. The Housing Minister wants tradies to work fast and get creative to meet the government's home building targets. Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson has welcomed news that some of Australia's biggest companies, along with government departments, have removed TikTok's data tracking tool Pixel. Other organisations are continuing to use the tracking code, believing they have put in place measures to restrict TikTok's ability to access users' personal information.
All right, I want to pick up this poll out yesterday by News Corp papers that found 80% of Australians believe the Albanese government has failed to address their cost of living crises. Now, on top of that, more than half of all Australians now say the country's headed in the wrong direction, with Labor's renewables push deeply unpopular with those polled. Let's bring in my panel for a closer look at this and a whole lot more. Sky News host James Morrow and Sky News Northern Territory correspondent Matt Cunningham. Well, Matt, I'll go to you first if I can. 74% of us say cost of living is a top priority for them, while just 4% say Indigenous affairs should be the government's focus. Now, we know last year the Voice was about all the PM was focused on. I think it cost him very much politically. He promised a reset. Where is it?
Well, I'm not convinced he needs a reset, Peter. I think he just needs to not bugger things up, because really a lot of the work has been done for him already when it comes to addressing cost of living issues. I think it's most likely we're going to get an interest rate cut somewhere in the middle of the year, and come July 1 we should also have stage 3 tax cuts come into play. Now, I think most Australians, the Australians who are really hurting at the moment are middle income Australians, people who have a mortgage, people who've seen their interest rates go up significantly, and people who've been affected badly by bracket creep over the past few years. So those two things can be addressed, and the Prime Minister really doesn't have to do anything except keep his caucus in check to make sure that happens. Those numbers are interesting. I think when it comes to those energy issues, I think that's going to be a real issue for the government between now and the next election, because people are going to be asking that question. They're going to be saying, where was that $275 saving that you promised me? That's not what I'm seeing when I get my electricity bill. Instead, I'm seeing a 20, 30, 40% increase. So I think that's going to be a massive issue this year and into the next election. I think it's interesting that 74% of people see cost of living as the biggest issue. That's no surprise. 4% say it's Indigenous affairs. But I do think the government still needs to do something when it comes to Indigenous affairs. I've just spent a week in Alice Springs, Peter. I can tell you things are as bad there as they've ever been. I know we don't have a referendum on the cards this year, but we do need to have a plan to address things that are going badly wrong in the Northern Territory at the moment.
Yeah, look, I watch your coverage and I agree with you. I think it looks like it did when we were up there this time last year. But I think he can't wash his hands. OK, he lost the voice, but that doesn't mean he sits there and does nothing. I think that's where he comes under pressure. But you're very kind. This is a first-term government. We expect them to do more than just not stuff up. I mean, James, he came back, saying just after New Year's Eve, basically, that he's going to have this reset, he's on top of his game. But then he headed off to the cricket. I suspect he'll be at the tennis the next fortnight. We need him behind his desk, don't we?
Well, I mean, what's he going to be doing while he's behind the desk? I mean, you can always make things worse by being active. The thing, though, is I think, the point here is that there's some real albatrosses around his neck here, one of them being, of course, this whole energy issue. And the problem is because, they've painted themselves so into this corner politically, absolutely adamantly saying we're going hard on renewables, adamantly saying we will not do anything with nuclear, adamantly saying, this is going to happen, it's going to push through whether you like it or not. Well, I mean, over the break, I talked to a lot of people in country Australia, in the bush, and farmers and so on, furious about the AEMO and their plans to run transmission lines through their properties. This is really bleeding him support beyond just in middle-class suburbs where people are hurting with their power prices. I just think, Peter, he has to really do something dramatic. A reset means a reset, and that means saying, hey, we're actually going to change the way we're approaching this. We've got a poll in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph about people's attitudes to nuclear power, including in Chris Bowen's own electorate, which I think will make some very sobering reading for the government.
James, just before we go, you and I caught up serendipitously in Horsham in Western Victoria, and we were both remarking how many farmers were saying to us that they were furious about the Bureau of Meteorology reporting going into that Christmas period that there would be horrific drought, there wouldn't be stock feed around, so they basically fire sold or shot in the paddock a lot of their stock. And of course, we've had a pretty wet summer down south. They didn't need to sell them, but they panicked.
Well, but they were told, you go back and, there's receipts on this. You go back and hear what the BOM, and I'll tell you what, the ABC did a really good job, too, amplifying this. This idea that it was going to be a horror summer of bushfire and drought. I talked to farmers in Victoria, in South Australia, who sold off stock, and now they say, well, we're not relying on the BOM anymore. We're going to private forecasting services. But all of these guys, they lost all their stock, and now they're going to have to restock. That's going to hit the cost of beef and lamb later on this year, too. Mark my words.
All right, Penny Wong, if I could go to that, please, Matt Cunningham. She's headed off today to the Middle East. Quite a fight today about what's in her official program. Jewish Australians angry that she's not going down to visit the sites of the Hamas attacks in the southern area of Israel. Mostly every other world leader has gone down there. And I think it matters, not because, politicians have to tick a box and go everywhere, but there is this narrative being put out by the pro-Palestinian lobby that, in fact, this actually never happened, that somehow the Israelis are making it all up. So I think her going there sends that message that Australia believes Israel. What do you make of the fight today?
Well, I think she'd probably be wise to reconsider that itinerary and make that trip. It's interesting what you say, this misinformation that's been put out there. I mean, it's conspiracy theory stuff, trying to say that this didn't happen. And I think it's spread even beyond just the pro-Palestinian lobby. I mean, I was bailed up a couple of weeks ago by a woman at the footy who, recognised me and then wanted to tell me that this was all being made up and, how could we possibly be reporting that, these people had been massacred and these hostages had been taken. This is the world we live in today, strangely enough. It's a difficult one for the Foreign Minister. It's a difficult one for all Labor politicians, all Labor ministers, because they're trying to walk between, walk both sides, if you know what I mean, because they have people within their own party who are very pro-Palestine, and who would not want Penny Wong to be going there and to be sort of siding with Israel in any way. So you can understand, the difficult line that she's trying to tread, but I think she would be wise to make that visit to southern Israel.
James?
Well, yeah, Peter, look, I think that this goes to not just about this particular issue. I think it is important that she go and see what happened in Sderot and places like that. I mean, that's, just to validate that experience, as Matt suggests. But beyond that, this is just another indication of how reactive this government is. They never wind up getting ahead of these events. They always wind up behind them. Remember when Rishi Sunak spoke at a synagogue in a temple in London soon after the attacks of October 7th? Albanese was still up in at Uluru waiting around for Pat Farmer to finish his walk for the Voice and had to be kind of dragged kicking and screaming to speak to the Jewish community in Melbourne. This is a pattern with this government. They're reactive and they're slow to act, and it's hurting them again on this really, really crucial issue.
Hey, just the Victorian seat of Dunkley, we've got a by-election there following the sad death of the Labor incumbent MP Peter Murphy. The Libs yesterday, this is the seat of Frankston and Langwarrin. It's in the southern parts of Melbourne close to the Mornington Peninsula. The Libs yesterday pre-selected 31-year-old Mayor, Frankston Mayor Nathan Conroy. He'll go head-to-head with the Labor candidate Jodie Bellier. What do you think here? It's a 6.3% seat, Labor seat. Some would say pretty safe Labor seat there, Matt Cunningham. But let's not forget the Liberal Bruce Bilson. He held the seat for 2 decades. Are we going to see a bit of a fight?
He was very popular too, wasn't he, Bruce Bilson? I actually lived in that seat for a while Bruce Bilson was the local MP. And I think that, I think it could be. I think this could be a real fight. I mean, I don't know much about him, the mayor, but he looks like an up-and-comer. I think Labor would be a little bit worried. It's certainly not going to be a rerun of the Ashton by-election. I think that this is going to be a closely run thing. And if the coalition does manage to pick up this seat, then I tell you what, it's game on ahead of the election next year.
Yeah, I was reminding my producers, because I'm so much older than them today, that in 2001 we had an election there, a by-election in the seat of Aston, where the incumbent Peter Nugent died in office, which is similar to as happened now. And you usually expect a swing against the government of the day. In that case, it was the Howard government. In this case, it's obviously Prime Minister Albanese. But when you've got an MP that dies in office, I think it's a particularly different set of circumstances. We haven't got a date yet there from the Speaker. When we do, I'll let you know. We'll watch that one closely. Just quickly, James, election season's kicked off officially in the US. This is the Iowa caucuses. Now, I want you to explain to my viewers how a caucus is a bit different from a primary, and how do you think it's going to play out?
Well, look, really quickly, Peter, it's crazy in Iowa right now because there's a freezing cold Arctic blast, a one-in-a-decade blizzard happening right now. So that's really completely thrown everybody's campaigns in disarray. The way this caucus works, though, is you have to physically show up at a caucus site, like a church basement or a school gym or something like that, and then listen to all the different candidates, representatives, give a presentation, and then at the end of that, you go and you vote, and they decide how many people get this vote and how many votes go to this candidate. So it's a really interesting bit of very American democracy. Now, Donald Trump is on about 48 to 52%. He's going to win it. But everybody's looking at that number 2 because Iowa doesn't necessarily declare who the nominee is going to be, but it weeds out losers. Everybody's looking at Nikki Haley right now. She's the only one who's been rising in the polls, but it could also be, all over for Ron DeSantis if he can't wind up getting above that 18 to 20% mark that he's been polling at as well.
Gents, I'll leave it there. James and Matt, thank you for your company. All right, overnight in Copenhagen, Australian-born Mary Donaldson became the Queen Consort of Denmark after the ruling monarch Queen Margrethe abdicated. And this is the first such abdication in over 900 years in Denmark. She handed the crown, of course, to her son, Mary's husband, the now 10th King Frederick of Denmark. The event lacked the sort of pomp and pageantry we've come to expect when we watch similar occasions out of the UK, but that didn't stop tens of thousands of Danes and others turning out to see history in the making.
After more than half a century, Denmark has a new king and queen. The ascension of Prince Frederick and Tasmanian-born Princess Mary Donaldson sealed with a kiss. The new sovereign was proclaimed by the Danish Prime Minister from the balcony of Christiansborg Palace. While not an official coronation, it is a ceremony steeped in tradition, dating back to the early 1900s. The new King and Queen of Denmark, Greenland and the Faroe Islands were cheered on by tens of thousands of people. The couple's firstborn, Christian, becomes crown prince and heir to the throne. Queen Margrethe will retain her title of Her Majesty as she takes on a supportive role, handing over the royal reins to the next generation, with Hobart-born Mary as Queen.
Sky News reporter Julia Bradley is in Copenhagen for this uniquely Australian-tinged moment in European history, and she joins me now. Well, you've had a momentous 24 hours, I suspect a cold one too. Julia, take us through the events that you witnessed.
Well, Peter, I'm so excited to take you through the historic events of the last 24 hours, but just first, I want to show you how beautiful it is in Copenhagen at the moment. Just in the past 20 minutes, it started snowing here. This as people continue to pack down from the day before. We're here at Christiansborg Palace, which is where that official proclamation took place. Now, the events kicked off yesterday with Queen Margrethe, an incredibly admired monarch here in Denmark. She's been on the throne for 52 years. She travelled from her royal residence to Christiansborg Palace to officially abdicate. And that is when the succession officially began. That is when we saw the royal couple, Frederick and now Mary Donaldson, make their way here as well. Now, they came out on the balcony of Christiansborg Palace, and this is where that official proclamation took place. They were alongside their 4 children, including their eldest Christian, who now becomes heir to the throne. Now, the Danish Prime Minister was there as well. She officially proclaimed Frederick the King, King Frederick X, and Mary, Queen of Denmark. It was here where we saw Frederick utter his royal motto, which is essentially united and dedicated to the Kingdom of Denmark. And it's that line which has made the front pages of the major newspapers here in Denmark this morning. And who could forget that moment, the royal kiss between Frederick and Mary on the balcony of Christiansborg Palace. Now, after this, it was certainly a party in Denmark last night. We saw people on every corner celebrating, just so happy to be here. There was an Australian-only event as well that hosted by the embassy. Champagne was flowing, and so too the Aussie banter.
Julia, sorry, I didn't know whether you were going to throw to some grabs there, but I understand there were Australians in the crowd. And look, as I was just watching that footage there of him at the balcony, and it seemed very emotional, the new king. It reminded me of the wedding. I remember watching Frederick and Mary get married, and I think he won the hearts of all Australian women because he was crying at the altar as she walked up the aisle. How has he been received as the king? Because we're told that she particularly is very popular.
They're incredibly popular, Peter. In fact, this is probably the most popular they've ever been. Everyone has been completely captured by that love story from the get-go. We know that they met back during the Sydney Olympics in 2000 at that Sydney pub, and the rest really is history. And we've seen them really grow and develop, not only as a couple, but also as partners. They're tackling big issues in Denmark. We know Mary's incredibly passionate about tackling domestic violence, bullying, loneliness, things like that. So this was really an incredible moment for the royal couple, but also for Denmark and also Aussies here just celebrating that incredible moment, which is really bringing our two countries closer together. How excited are you for this moment?
It is so exciting. It's such a historic day that I'm not sure we're going to see repeated in many, many years to come. And to see so many people gathered here today with warm hearts and good wishes to celebrate this transition.
Very excited, especially for Mary.
We've come to Copenhagen just for this experience today. We couldn't miss it.
Oh, yeah. Wow. And what do we love most about Mary?
Well, she's so stylish.
She is.
Her style.
She's also represented both of the countries so beautifully. She's so elegant.
So this morning we will see the new King and Queen of Denmark officially received in the Danish Parliament. This is when their ascension to the throne will be solidified. One thing that's going to be incredibly important for the royal couple is for them to continue to appear to be down to earth. One of the people, that is something that Queen Margrethe did so incredibly. Peter?
Absolutely did. She was a chain smoker, but she liked to get on a bike and go to the shops herself, even as Queen. Thank you, Julia. Stay warm. After the break, like the Voice vote, more evidence that the activist class is out of touch with everyday Australians when it comes to Australia Day. More talk from the Republican movement lobby today as well. And taxpayers tipping $63 million into the Australian Open tennis despite its record profits. Welcome back. Still to come, we'll get an update from a security expert about further shipping tensions in the Middle East. Victorian taxpayers bailing out tennis with millions. The Daniel Andrews tried to keep quiet before the state election, and our energy train work just got worse. But first, the dust has settled on Christmas. We've now welcomed in the new year. That must be, of course, it's time for the annual Australia Day debate. Sadly, it's happening every year now as a loud minority of activists look to change the date of our National Day and try to shame us into wanting not to celebrate this great country we live in. Well, the data's in, and it shows that only 17% of Australians believe Australia Day should be moved from January 26. Joining me now is the man behind the polling, Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Daniel, welcome to the show. No surprises from me. You and I talk to real people out there and we can see what real people think about our country when we have a big national vote like the Voice referendum. But I tell you, the activists, the elites, their voices are getting louder and louder every year. Tell us what your poll says, though, the real world thinks about our National Day.
Well, that's exactly right, Peter. Good to be with you again. What our poll found of a nationally represented sample of Australians is that 63% support Australia Day on the 26th of January. As you rightly say, fewer than 1 in 5 want to change the date, and the rest don't know or don't have an opinion. And exactly as you say, it shows yet again how this debate, this divisive debate that nobody really wants to have about Australia Day, is being driven by a small minority of activists, of the big corporates such as Woolworths. And I think Australians are just fed up with having this debate every single year. Mainstream Australians want to celebrate Australia Day because they understand what a great nation we are, our freedoms, our democracy, our way of life, our values. They are the envy of the world. They've attracted millions of migrants to our shores over the journey, and they want the opportunity to celebrate our day on the 26th of January. And as I say, they're fed up with the elites diminishing and demeaning our National Day.
Look, you rightly say we're a democracy. We are one of the world's oldest democracies ourselves. But I guess what worries me about this debate is that so much of the Australia Day choices are being taken out of our hands. We can't buy the merchandise anymore that we want. Aldi and Woolies, they've both cancelled it. Hard to find anywhere else. I guess you can go online. But you've also got all these councils. We're at 81 local councils now, basically banning anything to do with Australia Day on Australia Day by virtue of not holding citizenship ceremonies. Now, none of this is put to us in an election. We're not given a vote on this. It's all happening by stealth.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. And I think it goes to one of the big issues in our society, which is the massive cleavage and division that exists between the elites on the one hand and mainstream Australians on the other. You rightly point out earlier that the Voice debate highlighted that when almost every single major organisation and institution in our society supported or funded the Voice to Parliament, whereas mainstream Australians thoroughly rejected it, including 37% of Labor voters, which is an astonishing outcome. And so we go on with this division within our society. You're right to point out that Australians don't feel like they have a voice in many of the major debates that we have. And this is why record numbers of Australians are becoming disengaged from the political system, but it also presents a unique political opportunity for the coalition to speak for those working class voters, to give them a voice in the debates where they no longer have a home in the Labor Party or other parties as they may have in the past.
Is the risk, though, Daniel, that all of this happening, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, and as you say, a majority do not, that they just wear you down? That you get so sick of talking about this that people say, I disagree, but just move the date, just move it. I'm sick of having this fight when we should be proud of our country every January.
It is a risk, but we can never give up, Peter. We can't stop defending our National Day because, as you know, they'll move on to something next. If it's not Australia Day, it'll be Anzac Day. It'll be something else. Yeah, and those who say they want to change the date, they don't want to change the date. They want to cancel Australia Day. They know full well that if they change it from the 26th, then that will change the culture and the norms around that day, and it will significantly diminish the celebration of Australia Day. This is the truth, Peter, there is no day that will suit the activists. There is no day that will suit those like Woolworths to celebrate our National Day. As I say, they want to cancel it, so we can never give up. Just like with the Voice debate, when it had the Voice at 70% approval, well, you have to make the debate, you have to make the argument, you keep reinforcing the point that Australia is a great nation and we should celebrate it. And, you know, that's what democracy is about, so we just have to keep making the case.
And you are doing it well. Daniel Wild, thank you. I might add the only demographic that did not support Australia Day staying on the 26th were those under the age of 25. Yes, there's teachers and everybody else involved in the massive education that goes on, but please, grandparents and parents need to help correct that. Let's go now to the Middle East, which unfortunately has deteriorated further over the summer. Joining me now, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, thank you for your time. We've touched on the politics at the top of the show about the Foreign Minister's visit, but how do you think it's going to go down in Israel by her refusal to visit those southern towns?
Look, I don't think it's going to help. I think that it's unfortunate that she's chosen not to visit the kibbutz. Essentially, they're only a short distance from where she's holding meetings with the Israeli government. So really, there's no valid justification for her to say she can't visit them. And I think it would have shown sensitivity on her part to the victims of that Hamas attack to at least go and visit the site of the attack. She is meeting with the victims, the survivors, I should say, of that attack, but she should at least go to the site where that attack occurred and recognise the loss that occurred there on October the 7th.
What about the case being brought by South Africa? They're a proxy, of course, in the International Court of Justice against what's been labelled Israel's genocidal acts. We know the case could take some years to play out, but South Africa is pushing for interim measures which would stop Israel bombing targets. Is this going to hamper Israel's efforts to eliminate Hamas?
Look, I don't think it's a justifiable case. My understanding of the term genocide means a deliberate attempt to wipe out a race of people. And the last time that happened, ironically, was the Nazi Germany trying to eliminate the Jewish people. I think what you have here is Israel trying to defend its country against Hamas, which is, after all, about wiping out the Israeli people and wiping out the state of Israel. And they are trying to do this in incredibly complex operational circumstances. Gaza is a very small, constrained and heavily congested operational environment that's urban in nature. There's not a lot of space for people to hide. Israel has given every opportunity for Palestinian civilians to try and escape from the area where hostilities are occurring. Unfortunately, there's nowhere for them to go. And also equally unfortunate is that Hamas are denying them the ability to flee. So I think that Israel is trying to do what it can to avoid civilians. But I do think there is a case to be made to the Israelis to transition away from large-scale use of air power and artillery and emphasise more on ground force actions that can be more discriminate and operate more within the laws of armed conflict. I think that's a justifiable request.
Talk to me about the Red Sea, because Australia backed those airstrikes against the Houthis' stronghold in Yemen last week. But, of course, we snubbed a US request to send a warship, a frigate, in December. It was big news. I was overseas in the US at the time. Big news over there. Certainly big news also in the UK. Lots of other countries were there. I felt we really squibbed it. Given how much of our trade comes through that trade route, everyone's now going around the Horn of Africa. That adds at least 10 days and many, many costs, obviously, to shipping into Australia. Can we do more?
We certainly can do more. And I think that, this crisis in the Red Sea is not over yet. Today, the Houthis tried to launch an anti-ship cruise missile, which was intercepted by a US Navy fighter jet. I think that this is likely to go on. You're likely to see the Houthis continue to fire missiles. So what we could do, for example, is send aircraft into the region known as wedge-tails, which could directly support the US Navy and Royal Navy operations by providing additional air defence cover. We could also provide additional aircraft to airborne refuel US Navy and US Royal Navy US Navy jets. And I think the other thing we could do is backfill US Navy forces in the Indo-Pacific to free them up to go to the Indo-Pacific. So there is more that we can do.
Well, we'll watch that one closely when Parliament returns. Just quickly, the Taiwanese elections over the weekend. President Xi has made it very clear he wanted Taiwan to fall into line. They didn't. They rebuked Beijing and they re-elected the Democratic Progressive Party. What happens now? How's this going to play out with Xi?
Okay, what's going to happen is that the Chinese are going to escalate their coercive grey zone actions to try and intimidate and coerce the Taiwanese people into accepting what is known as the 1992 consensus, which is Beijing's terms for imposing unification. That will fail because the Taiwanese people have seen what happened to Xinjiang, what happened to Tibet, what happened to Hong Kong. They don't want unification with China under Chinese Communist Party rule. The vast majority of Taiwanese want the status quo. That's unacceptable to Xi. So I think that what you will see eventually, potentially in the second half of this decade, once it becomes clear that coercion has failed, is that China will use force to try and impose unification on Taiwan against the will of the Taiwanese people. And then Australia, the US, Japan and others have a critical decision to make on how to respond to that act of aggression by China.
Right, Malcolm Davis said it is a worrying concern, but we know it's real. Thank you for your time. Right, just late this afternoon too, I want to let you know that Nauru has announced it will cut off diplomatic relations with Taiwan and instead recognise mainland China. I'd want to know how many millions of dollars are involved in that transaction. Right after the break, more weasel words from federal Labor when it comes to your Stage 3 tax cuts. They're legislated. You're supposed to get them from 1 July. Let's see if you do. Plus more energy madness, those blackouts still on the cards due to our obsession with renewables. Welcome back. Plenty to get through now with my next panel. Joining me, Sky News contributor, former Howard Government Minister Gary Hardgrave, and Pauline Hanson's One Nation Chief of Staff, of course, candidate in the Queensland election, James Ashby. Gents, welcome. I hope you both had a good break. Let's get to those Stage 3 tax cuts. Set to kick in from July 1. They're legislated. We should have money in our pocket. Data out today says it's worth $1,300 to average Australians, or 6 years' worth of bracket creep. Now, we all know cost of living's biting. These tax cuts will help. But the PM, pretty cagey today about unequivocally supporting them. Have a listen.
In terms of income tax relief, that is one way that can assist people because it does mean extra dollars in people's pockets.
Mate, Gary, you have been around as long as I have. If we were getting these tax cuts, he wouldn't use the woozle words he did today, would he?
Well, no, he wouldn't, and it's our money. I mean, that's the point. Government are really good at these handouts things. This is for free, that's for free. The Queensland Premier is saying TAFE is now free, childcare is free. It's not free, it's taxpayers' money. And frankly, if governments don't trust you, they'll take more tax off you. They'll regulate you and legislate against you. So this government doesn't trust us with our own money. And Peter, we need to have that money in our pocket. We know how to best spend our money. That's what I believe. Most Australians are good at it. Some foul up, but we have safety nets there for them. But the Prime Minister is certainly trying to find the Australia Institute way out of this. Let's have more bureaucracy, doling out little things and making ministers look really important with our money. Give it back to us, Albo. Stop taking the money away from us. Trust us. Let us have these tax cuts. And 1 July is the date.
Again, I'm showing my age here, but we can all remember Keating and those LAW law tax cuts. Elbows are the same mould, I think. Watch it, Australia. I don't know that they're going to turn up. Let's go to Victoria, James. What did you make of revelations today that poor old broke Victorian taxpayers paid Tennis Australia $63 million as part of a pandemic bailout? And of course, the Premier then, Daniel Andrews, before the election, tried to keep it all quiet. Have a listen.
If the government has nothing to hide, why did it take an FOI from the opposition leader's office to uncover the $63 million payment that was made to Tennis Australia on the back of the pandemic? The government can try and spin this any way they want. They don't know how to manage money.
Now, James, I get it. Tennis, and I love the tennis, brings a lot of money into Victoria. But two things here. One, we only know about it because of this FOI. That's shocking, yet again, from government. But second, given they do well, given this was just for the pandemic, they've made profits since, surely they've got to pay it back.
Well, this goes to the heart of why Australians deserve tax cuts, because governments are collecting, well, combined about $1.9 billion worth of taxes every single day, Peter Credlin. $1.9 billion a day in total taxes across state and federal, and they're doling it out to netball, and here they are doling it out to the tennis. Mind you, I must say the prize money at this year's tennis hasn't decreased. It's about $86.5 million, and here we are chipping in all that money from estate coffers. I'm sorry, this is what upsets the taxpayers of today. Stop. We don't have a problem collecting taxes. We've got a problem with spending the money in the appropriate areas. Stop it.
Yep. Spot on. Spot on. Spot on. Yep. Let's go to WA. The news last week that Alcoa will close Kwinana. This is the alumina refinery by 2025, so imminent. 800 jobs, will be lost. It's in the Premier's seat, Cook's seat. It's also in the Resource Minister Madeleine King's seat. Both say, look, it's not our fault. This has long been on the cards. But Gary, if you read all the expert analysis that I have over the last week, everybody says this is the canary in the coal mine. This is the first really big major industry player leaving Australia because of our power prices.
Absolutely, and Peter, the Gladstone alumina refinery in Queensland is also kind of on a bit of a watch and act situation. It's all down to electricity. It's the number one ingredient after bauxite in the making of alumina and from that, of course, aluminium. Look, we should have, and Western Australia relies heavily on its gas industry, but the East Coast gas sector, we are the Saudi Arabia of the gas world. Australia should have the cheapest gas available for domestic consumption. You've got the Victoria government wiping out the use of gas in people's homes. We should have the cheapest gas in the world. We sell it, though, at the price the world is willing to pay for it. I wouldn't imagine any of the sheikhs in Saudi Arabia wanting to spend the sort of money per litre on fuel that we have to, because they sell it to the world for a certain price. They use it at a far cheaper price. We should be doing the same thing with gas. We should be having these industries here. We should be expanding these industries here and making more things here. The reason why? It's the energy cost. And this Albanese government with that mad, bad Chris Bowen are at the heart of ruining a lot of everyday people's lives and manipulating us to a worse future than the one we inherited from our parents and our grandparents, and they should hang their heads in shame, in my view.
James, just before we go, I mean, in Victoria, we know it's playing out everywhere. There's this real fight now between those, in the case of Victoria, it's a state government, wanting to bring down emissions, and others wanting to protect the natural environment. And this is where Tanya Plibersek and the Victorian government have really come to swords on the issue of the Hastings port. But we know, as they're rolling out all the renewables around the country, they're cutting down trees, they're endangering wildlife, all for the climate gods in Glasgow or Copenhagen or wherever they might be.
Yeah, and one of the most endangered species right here in this country is manufacturing. And exactly back to the heart of that banana issue, Gary's right. China is the biggest producer now of aluminium. They're paying 11 cents a kilowatt hour versus our 34 cents commercially. So that's what this government are killing. And I'm sorry to say it, we're going to see more industry go as we transition more to these renewables like wind. Unless we all raise our voices. Gary and James, thank you both. This is the year of fight back. I tell you, 2024, we're fighting back. That's it for me tonight. Andrew Bolt's coming up next. See you tomorrow night at 6.